thank you very much for joining us at the Microsoft Power BI UK user group. And we're back again for another fantastic webinar. And this time I'm joined by Microsoft MVP, Benny Dick Jagger, if I can pronounce that right. We did go through it beforehand and I still got it wrong. So we'll try that one again towards the tail end of the show. But Benny, thank you very much for joining us. And thank you to everybody else for joining us as well as part of the community. As always, I'd just like to go through a few ground rules. The Q&A is indeed open, so please do feel free that this is an interactive session to ask your questions throughout, and we will obviously make sure that they're all answered throughout and towards the end of this session. I'll just give you a bit of a background in regards to Benny. So Benny is an enterprise data architect, and as I've already mentioned, a Microsoft MVP for the data platform. He aspires to be the top notch in his field through personal development of both technical and soft skills. And as I mentioned, Benny is known rather to tackle and pick up fresh ideas to broaden his range. By building on past experiences, he continues to try to find new and more efficient ways of obtaining results and improving processes along the way. When he isn't working, you can find him blogging or reading, and you'll find him likely hanging out with a group that go by the name of Data Minds. So I'd love to hear more about them as well throughout this session. So without any further ado, like I say, thank you all for joining me, and I'll hand you over to Benny.
All right, thank you, Leon. First, before I do kick off, congratulations to you as well, Leon, on your recent award with the MVP award. It's been fairly fresh, so many congratulations.
Thank you very much.
And then let's get started. So as Leon mentioned, my name is Benny de Jager, and I'm an enterprise data architect, which means that I do a lot of Teams meetings, I write a lot of governance documents, and I send way too many emails. That's pretty much the day-to-day job that I have these days. But it's all about Power BI, it's all about data, and it's all about architecture. It's all about getting insights for our customer, making sure that they can do something relevant with it. As I mentioned, as Leon mentioned, I do fiddle about a bit with a band of people that go by the name of Data Minds. That is a user group out in Belgium. We do all sorts of fun stuff like webinars as well. We hope to move back to in-person user group meetings. And we also run a 2-day conference out in Belgium that's coming up in October. If you want to reach out to me through the social channels, you can find my Twitter handle, my LinkedIn handle. If you want to find any of my other sessions that I can present or that I have presented in the past, you can find them on the Sessionize profile as well. As Leon mentioned, please do feel free to publish your questions. Please do feel free to put them in. I love these questions because they also help to get me. They also help me to get a better grasp of what topics you're asking for and what is important to you. But let's get kicking. The thing is that when people ask me questions about data flows, I am usually very confused. And it's not easy. Well, it's pretty easy to confuse me because I am easily confused. But the thing is that data flows is, I've been going around for a few years. I've been working in the field for about 10 years now. And the word data flows has been used way too many times. So it is when someone says to me that, okay, I'm using data flows, well, there's a few things that start to go off in my head. Potentially, it could be that they're talking about Google Cloud data flows, or that they're talking about TensorFlow data flows. Maybe they're even talking about SSIS, so integration services data flows, or they're talking about Microsoft Flow, which has turned into Power Automate. They're talking about Azure Data Factory, which has mapping data flows and wrangling data flows, but wrangling data flows turned into Power Query Online. And maybe it's Power Apps data flows, but Power Apps data flows turn into Power Platform data flows. There's way too many usage of the word data flows, but to make it crystal clear, right now we are talking about Power BI data flows. That's it, Power BI data flows. And to get that question out of the way as well, yes, there is a difference between Power Platform data flows and Power BI data flows. So it is specifically Power BI data flows that we're diving into today. There are a few questions that I like to see answered myself when I talk about data flows, when I look at my customers, when I look at the types of projects I'm working with, and what kind of questions that I need to see answered if data flows could potentially be a good fit for what I'm doing there. The first question is, well, who should be using data flows, which is something really important. And in my point of view, that's the experience I've built on from the past. That's the things I've seen in the field. It is mainly aimed at those financial users, those power users. So the people you've seen dabbling about doing dark wizardry in Excel and doing way too many VLOOKUPs and XLOOKUP functions, etc. So people that have some kind of feeling with data. We're talking about business analysts. We're talking about people that are generally a bit tech savvy as well. Does that mean that the hardcore, the diehard code developer in whatever code they're writing can't use data flows? No, they can actually use it as well. But the persona that Microsoft sees as well is that the business user, the power user, to aim at that self-service type of user. What is this thing called a data flow? Well, to answer that question, there is something that we need to talk about first. Because there is this thing that I like to call one entity, many data sets. What do I mean by an entity? It could be a table, for instance, or something, a functional name that you're talking about. It could be your products. It could be your employee. It could be your divisions. It could be your departments. It could be your P&L departments. It can be many different things. The thing is, when we're looking at having multiple data sets and having multiple locations where we need to be creating Power BI artifacts and Power BI data sets and Power BI reports, there is likely a very, very high chance that you'll be reusing logic. And the thing is that the reusability story for Power BI is a bit skewed, because when we're looking at shared data sets, it's an all or nothing approach. It means that we connect to a shared data set and we use the entirety of that shared data set, or we use nothing at all. If we don't use shared data sets and we have to create those logics again, those queries again, then potentially we're running into issues where if we need to change something, we need to go change it at 17 different places, which can potentially become really bothersome. And then the thing is that we also have this feature called direct query over Power BI datasets in Azure Analysis Services, or Composite Models V2, or Composite Models, or whatever you'd like to call them. That's been introduced recently as well. It is still a preview feature, but it has the potential to start disrupting the way we're going to work and the way we're going to think about these things in the future, because that also allows us to use a single piece from a data set, a single table or two tables from that data set, and then another table from that data set, and then drag in another table ourselves. It allows us to mix and mingle those different data sets together. The thing is, it is currently still in preview. You run into some performance issues, you run into some chaining issues, so it's not completely there yet. And specifically for that reusability story, this is where, at this point, I see data flows as a really, really good example, as a really good piece in the entire puzzle. For instance, let's say that we have a date dimension. Because as we all know, if we're creating a Power BI report, we're always having a date table. We're always having a date dimension. So many of us, we either do a calendar table in DAX, or we find Reza script on Radicat.com to do it in Power Query. We go to our data warehouse, or whatever, we get our date dimension somewhere. And pretty much in every single Power BI file that we have, we reuse that same date dimension. What if tomorrow the CEO and the CFO come to us and say, hey everyone, so our fiscal year is going to start on April 1st next year. So can you make sure that this is reflected as well in our Power BI data sets? So in many cases, at many of my customers, this is going to be troublesome, period, because they have to go fix the fiscal year in many, many, many different places, because there is no consolidated base for their data sets that they have. This is where potentially we can look at a data flow to reuse, to put a single dates table, or look at products table, look at employee table, whatever you want to use in there, to put it in front of those PBIX files and serve as a single layer for that logic. And then we can just go ahead and start reusing that data flow in our multiple data sets. If the fiscal year changes or something, or if we need to change some logic to the way that we're calculating periods or something, then it's a single change and everything we use it. However, keep in mind that if you're creating a single object that has many dependencies, you do need to keep the schema integrity up, because as soon as you introduce a breaking change, then the entire circle around it will probably also be breaking if you're all reusing that same table. So it is definitely something to keep a very good eye on. But how is this? How does this thing of data flows actually work? What is it? What are we looking at? What do we need to understand for it? Well, Power BI data flows was introduced in late 2018, November or December. I keep forgetting the exact month, and it went into general availability in April 2019, which means that it's actually just over 2 years old. It's not that old yet. It means that it's still a very young product. The thing is as well is the versions that we've seen in preview, the versions that we've seen in general availability, and the version that we're seeing now, and the features that have already been announced for coming months, coming year, that's a very big difference. It means that the product, that the data flows itself are evolving at a very rapid pace, as is the story, as is the thing with the entire universe of Power BI. Essentially, it is a cloud-based Power Query experience. Power Query Online, if you will. It is, as I mentioned before, aimed at self-service data preparation for those non-technical user personas. But it doesn't rule out the technical personas. Everyone can work with data flows if they see it fit for their use case. It is meant to build out reusable data entities. Reusable, that's the key story here. Reuse across different data sets. My personal opinion, I don't see it as a replacement for a full-blown enterprise data warehouse solution. They both have their merits. An enterprise data warehouse solution, or data lake, or data lakehouse, or delta lake, whatever you want to call it, an enterprise semantic model will always have its place. Data flows themselves also have their place because you can get started with it a lot quicker. Usually, you can start building things. You can start actually seeing results a lot quicker than with those other types of solutions. But I'm already seeing a question here that will we ever see slowly changing dimensions to be a future of data flows? Honest question, honest answer. I don't know. I've not seen any public announcements. I can honestly tell that I've also not seen any NDA announcements. But I am rooting for that as well, because the slowly changing dimension is something that is still very hard to fix with a Power BI data flow right now. It can be done, but it's not that very easy. It takes a lot of logic, it takes a lot of Power Query to start fixing it. That's where we get to that enterprise semantic model. That's where we go to shine with slowly changing dimensions, for instance. But it manages and it handles, it's securable like mostly any other Power BI artifact. It is something that resides in a workspace, and we manage it the exact same way. We manage it like a workspace. But underneath, it's this magical thing called a managed CDM folder, a managed common data model folder. And common data model, I'll gladly get back to in after the first demo. Because I also wanted to show you briefly what is this thing of Power BI data flows? What's the look and feel? What does it do actually? To give you some context on the data that I work with, it is based on the public data set, the open data that you can get from the city of New York City. So they have city bikes, which means that you can get a bike from a station, drive around, put it back in another station, put it back in the same station, doesn't really matter. The data starts in June 2013. Every month there is a new file that has been released, and it contains all the trips that are longer than 60 seconds and that start at a public station. So right now they are at, since June 2013, they are at 120 million trips, which makes it also a fun data set to do some performance testing, to test some breaking things. But let me get to Power BI. What you're seeing here is my, well, let's say personal workspace called The Playground. And for some reason, Zoom it's not working. It's my workspace called The Playground, which means that it's just a bunch of random things in here and things that I do to break things, things that I use to start presenting. I have this thing called a data flow. Let me zoom in again. I have this thing called a data flow. I can open this up and I see a table or an entity, whatever you want to call it. And it is really comparable to what we can see in Power BI Desktop as well, because as soon as I go to edit tables, let me just try to see if I can get zoom it back up again. There we go. That's going to be a bit better. So what we're seeing here is it is Power Query Online. It is a really similar feeling to what we have in Power BI Desktop, because we have our get data experience, we have the queries that we have on the left-hand panel, we have the applied steps on the right-hand panel, we have all the different transformations that we have here. Is it 100% exactly the same? No, there are some mild changes in the user interface. Some buttons exist in Power BI Desktop, some buttons exist in Power BI Data Flows. Over time, they will be converging into a more similar experience, but it's going to take some time. The thing is what I'm seeing here, as I mentioned, is exactly the same. What I'm seeing is the queries that I'm trying to do, and then, for instance, some steps that are being added. So this is a time dimension. It's a Power Query script that I found from Riza, that I grabbed from Riza. It's really useful for demos, and it's just a bunch of steps. As soon as I go back to my advanced editor, it's exactly the same thing as we were seeing. But what's for me the kicker really for what I'm seeing here is we have these things over here. And this is something that doesn't exist currently in Power BI Desktop. It's coming, hopefully soon, not sure when exactly, but this is something that is called a query folding indicator. Not diving into query folding, it's the process where we're sending transformations back to the data source to do the heavy lifting there and allow Power BI, allow Power BI Data Flows to focus on the other things that need to be done as well. It's an indicator, meaning that if it's gray, we can't conclude if it's folding or not. If it's green, it's folding. If it's red, it's not folding. If you're learning how query folding works, this is a really interesting thing because it's a lot easier and a lot more intuitive to figure out if it's actually doing something rather than the experience that we had in Power Query in Power BI Desktop. The other thing, what I think personally is something really cool, is this thing called a diagram view. Hopefully, again, coming soon to a Power Query Desktop, Power BI Desktop near us, but it does allow us to, if I select the diagram view, it does allow us to see what we have inside of our different tables. And it allows us to see a bit of a lineage across our different tables as well. Which tables are inheriting fields from other tables? Which steps are we actually trying to do? And so if I go back to the example that I had for my time query, my timetable, it's showing it's showing all of these different transformations that I have. And if you've ever worked with something like an Alteryx or a Tableau Prep, this is going to be seeming, well, very familiar to you. It's just a more visual, interactive experience to help you get an easy overview of what's happening. So if you're the one that has created these things, then most likely you're already going to be knowing. But if it's a data flow that you're inheriting from someone, or if you're a consultant and you're arriving in a new environment, this is going to be some really helpful things to try to give you a quick and decent overview of what's actually happening. As for feature parity, the experience is largely the same. Most of the things, let's say 99% of the things that you can do in Power BI Desktop, you can also do here. If it's not showing up in the user interface, it should work by just pasting in the code from Power BI Desktop or copy and pasting the query. The thing is, I started off from a existing data flow. What if I wanted to create a new data flow? I go to my workspace, I say, okay, I want to create a new data flow. Then I have a bunch of options. Right now, I just want to say, okay, I want to start from new tables. This is just, I want to create new tables. I want to create a new data flow starting here. Then I need to choose my data sources. So let me just get a Azure SQL DB. Always keep forgetting. Go. I'd be surprised. Yeah, that's what I thought. I'd be surprised if I typed the credentials incorrectly. Yeah, so let me just do it differently. Let me just start off from a blank table. Let me show you what I actually wanted to show you as well. So as soon as I'm in here, as soon as I've selected the data sources that I want to be working in, it's essentially the same thing. I can go ahead and start getting my data. I can start doing these things. But what if I actually created something already in Power BI Desktop. So I'm working right now in Power BI Desktop, so just the on-premises version. What if I want to migrate this to a data flow? There are open source community initiatives, I think by Marcus Wegener, that has PowerShell scripts that extracts Power Query, uploads it to Power BI Service. But it's been made a lot easier these days as well, because I can actually just go ahead and say, okay, I'm doing a Control-C for copying. That makes sure that I can actually get it there. And then I just do Control-V, and then I can get that data in here as well. I can just copy over those transformations that I have. And then it's just going to give me the same things. We'll see the query steps that have been implemented as well. It's taking over, because it's still in the cache from the things that I was testing. It's taking over the credentials that I had, and I can get started with this. I can go ahead and start building. I can start building my own queries. I can start building the logic that I need to have. So as soon as I go ahead and say, okay, let me just save this, then it is going to be a new data flow that I need to give it, and then it's going to save that. Then I can say, okay, refresh the data now, or set up a refresh schedule. I'm not going to refresh the data because I already have Power BI data flows that I can do something with. And then it's going to show up as well here as a data flow. Okay, so great, I have a data flow. So now what do I do? Well, I can actually open up a new Power BI Desktop, because that's the key part of these things. What are we actually going to do when we've created that data flow? How do we actually start using it? The thing is that a Power BI data flow works as a data source, works as any other data source that you have inside of Power BI. As soon as I've opened up Power BI Desktop, then I can say, okay, give me more data. And then as soon as I get to go to my get data experience, I can say, okay, do Power BI data flows. You can also take the long route and say, give me all the data sources and try to find it, but it's essentially the same thing. Is it really going to be doing this again? So potentially I'm not going to be able to log in to my Power BI Desktop. Potentially, most likely, which is problematic. The thing is, you'll have to take my word for it right now, is that as soon as I have signed in, it's going to give me the pop-up window that you can get when using the shared datasets approach as well. It's going to show you all the data flows that you have access to, meaning all the data flows that reside in workspaces that you are a part of. Then you can use those data flows. You can get the data. If you want to get some other data in there from a SQL server, from Excel files, from Access, from an API, it's import mode most of the time. So you can actually go ahead and start mixing, matching, getting different data flows into each other again. So I am just going to kill this off and consider this as a failed attempt by the demo gods. Well, a successful attempt by the demo gods, but a failed attempt by me. And then get back to slides. Because there is more things that I actually want to talk about. There is the thing that I mentioned from Common Data Model. What is this thing? What does it actually do? Well, what you need to consider is the Common Data Model is, the official term is, it's a unified metadata layer for cloud apps and services. So it is an attempt to speak the same language. It is a shared set of data language. It's the same way. It's a standard for storing data. It's a standard for locating data. And it comes with a set of default entities as well. The thing is, the beauty of Common Data Model is that it's not just Microsoft. It's part of something called the Open Data Initiative. And they are also joined by Adobe and I think it's SAP. Yeah, Adobe and SAP, which means that it's actually across different vendors that they are sharing that same format. So it is potentially even more interesting because it would allow you to speak the same language across those different vendors when you're going for those integration scenarios. The thing is, in reality, even within the Microsoft ecosystem, the Common Data Model is not so common across the different sectors, across the different flavors. There are still some issues that occur when you're trying to integrate different products and different services into each other. It's improving. The experience will be converging more into the future. But it's an ongoing journey. Let me put it like this. But the entire intent is to simplify integration and to disambiguate data. Any entity that currently exists can be extended. You can create your own entities, which means that you can pretty much do whatever you want to, as long as you just use the format that is expected. So to give you an idea of the base entities that currently exist, they're mostly aimed at the CRM part, sort of Dynamics 365 customer engagement, which means that it's all about sales, all about finance and operations as well, all about customers, about prospects, about opportunities. Those are the base. Those are the base entities that exist. But as I mentioned, you can actually also go ahead and start extending it, start building the own entities that you actually need to have. How does this tie into the bigger ecosystem? Well, it's something that's really important as well. This slide is horrendously outdated, but I haven't found a decent slide that gives me the same picture. It is this thing called CDN folders, which resides in Azure Data Lake Storage Generation 2. So you're using a data lake underneath. And it's not important to know that, because usually all these tools and all these services will do an abstraction there for you, but it is pretty cool how it works underneath. And the beauty of this thing is that when we're looking at Dynamics 365 with common data services, if we're looking at Power Apps and Dataverse, if we're looking potentially at even different tools like Databricks, like Synapse, etc., they can all access, they can all write, they can all read with that same Azure Data Lake storage. So potentially that's where it's really getting interesting for larger integrations across the board. The thing is, it's hard at this point to get the exact same language from all the different angles. For instance, Power Platform data flows and Power BI data flows, they use a slightly different dialect of the common data model, and it's not a one-to-one match at this point. Hopefully we'll be seeing it soon. But this thing called common data model is essentially a bunch of CSV files. So it is a bunch of CSV files that are stored in a data lake. That's it. There's nothing more to it. We're all working with CSV files. So those CSV files, they get saved. They are located in a entity, so the table name that we had. So I was working with station, so that would say station, and then it's going to automatically decide how it's going to partition those CSV files. And then the crucial thing is this thing called a model.json file. That's what's describing the metadata. That's what's describing the entirety of the tables, the columns, the data types, the data flow itself. So that's the really crucial thing. And it's that model.json file in combination with the thing that works under the covers called a manifest that needs to be the same between those different things. And that's currently not there yet. But in the ideal scenario, when we're looking ahead, when we're trying these things even to get things together, we can have those data from Dynamics 365, from Power Apps, from even from, let's say, Azure Synapse, from Power BI. We can all have them in the same storage, and they can all happily work together. It can be done at this point, but it's not really efficient. It's waiting until it gets more efficient in the future. So a demo on common data model, which is a really simple one, to be honest, because I just want to show you what does this JSON file look like. It is, if I go to my New York City bike, I say export JSON, it's going to give me a JSON file. As soon as I have that JSON file, I'll go ahead and open that using Visual Studio Code, but you can do it with Notepad, you can do it with Word probably as well. Any text editor that has a vague form of support for a JSON file. So what I'm seeing is, I'm seeing all these different things come back. I'm seeing the gender table that I had. I'm seeing a user type that I had. I'm seeing my timetable. I'm seeing my station table. So it all just describes what I have. And what I'm seeing here is, this is, well, most likely the timetable. It also holds all these different it holds the Power Query statements as well. And then if I go down a bit deeper, it holds the data types, etc. So it's just a dictionary. It's a metadata definition of the entirety of that data flow. So let's say that I also want to give it, let's say that I also want to upload it again. Potentially, I could also go back and say, well, okay, let's just create a data flow. I can go ahead and say, yes, okay, let's import that model. get New York City Bike, and then import it, and then, whoops, it's going to create it again. You could also do it with APIs so that you can automate the entire process, which can potentially be really interesting if you're working with CI/CD, with continuous improvement, continuous deployment. There are lots of opportunities, there are lots of possibilities there to do. The thing is, okay, we've had a bit on the specifics, we had a bit on the technical side, but how do we actually go about and start practically using this? How do we make sure that our data is kept up to date? Well, it can be as simple as just triggering a manual refresh in the user interface, just going to that object and say, refresh now. Or we can set up a scheduled refresh, which is the exact same way of working as we have a data set. If it has a dependency on gateway, we need to make sure that it's created in the gateway, that we have the credentials set. If it's online sources, we need to have those credentials. But as soon as we have those things running, then we can just get scheduled refreshes out of the way, exactly the same thing. The thing is, and that's me being honest, it's a bit tricky to get, well, it's less tricky these days, but it's still a bit tricky to get the full-blown error messages when your queries are failing for some odd reason. The only way that you can get that data out is by going to your refresh history, by downloading the result set, or you could also start scraping your gateways, but it's not super easy and super efficient to get those error messages out on why it's failing. So that's why you need to use your refresh history or gateway logs to get these things out. The thing is, I've only talked about a single data flow right now, but you can also go ahead and start linking data flows to each other. And then as soon as you have that, as soon as you have those links, as soon as you have those chains up and running, it will automatically refresh any data flow that it depends on itself, that it is dependent on. And for the time being, incremental refresh, and for the coming periods as well, I don't expect it to change anytime soon. Incremental refresh for Power BI data flows is premium only, and it's going to be that same way as well. It is because of technical limitations that incremental refresh requires something called the enhanced compute engine. I'll get back to that. And that I don't see that coming to Power BI Pro anytime soon. So it means you need to have premium capacity, you need to have premium per user, or an embedded capacity that you're slightly abusing as well. Okay, but how do we go ahead and start reusing those queries? To migrate between Power Query in the desktop, Power BI desktop, and Power BI in this cloud service, Power Query Online, there's no real automatic migration experience, or you have to rely on community initiatives, but it is actually possible to go ahead and copy paste those queries. Most of the times it will work going from Power BI desktop to Power Query Online. It's starting to work for some scenarios where you have Power BI data flows to Power BI desktop. I've not had 100% success with it, but it's gradually improving along the way as we see fit as well. But then if we're running our queries, reusing those queries is exactly the same thing. We need to append, merge, duplicate, reference a query, and make sure that they are marked as disabled for load. So that the thing is that if we're referencing, if we're appending, if we're merging, if we're duplicating, the data will always be duplicated. So potentially you're duplicating data and you're loading data multiple times depending what you're doing. Not always the desired state that we have. There is this thing also called linked or computed entities, which is a premium only feature. So premium per user, because it requires this thing called in-lake compute. And in-lake compute effectively means that it's trying to do those transformations inside of Power BI, inside of the data lake that you have. So it means that essentially, if we're running on shared capacity on Power BI Pro, and I also need to change dedicated capacity, if we're running it on Power BI Pro, it's going to get the new data, make sure it does those transformations again, store the data again, remove the old file. What it's going to be trying to do with the in-lake compute is it's going to do the transformations inside of the data lake and then change it itself. So the data is not getting out, it's not going out and in of the data lake again. The in-lake compute requires dedicated or premium capacity, It can reference any entity in any workspace, and usually the data will only be stored in the original entity. So you're reusing logic, but you're not duplicating data, which can be a really interesting thing as well. So, okay, good. How do I go about and actually start reusing things? And I do have to say, let me be quite frank and honest about this. I currently don't have a premium capacity or a premium per user account. I've requested it about 2 to 3 months ago, but apparently there's some issues with the license desk to start handing out those premium per user licenses, which means that I cannot show the premium per the in-link compute actions as well. So the basic things, how do we go ahead and start referencing data? How do we start duplicating? It's the same thing as we've been seeing inside of Power BI Desktop. It is just go ahead and say, okay, either I want to duplicate the query or I want to reference the query. As soon as I reference the query, it's going to be created there as well. And then something weird happens, because right now it's saying that it's a computed table or a computed entity. So that would mean that it is actually requiring to have premium. Why is this happening? The thing is that what I mentioned, we actually have to make sure that it's not enabled for load, that it's only being used under the covers, and then I can start referencing it, then I can start using it. So it's an important thing to keep in mind as well, that it may be a bit different as to what you're used to in Power BI Desktop. That's a really important thing. If you have premium per user, go nuts. You can still start reusing the same things, the same logics, the same methods that you had in the past. Just enjoy. Same thing, if you want to go duplicating, it's the entirety of those same things. If you want to go merging queries, then you say, okay, I have my station. Let me just try and merge a query, go to a region, for instance, because I know that this is the one that I need. It's none of these things have actually changed. They just look a bit different because you have a more visual interaction. You have a more visual representation as opposed to what we're seeing in Power BI Desktop. Mind you, my personal opinion is because of these more visual things that we're seeing, it is actually more intuitive and more interesting to get started with if you're not that technical person. If you're coming from an Excel world, for instance, it is more interesting to start working with Power Query in the online version. Yes, these things are all coming to Power BI Desktop as well, but I don't really have an ETA for these things. So the reusability part is mostly the same. But let's say that I would want to, let's say that I would want to go ahead and start actually linking things. I can, if I say, okay, I want to have a linked table for something else, I can go ahead and start connecting to the data flows that I have. It's not working for me today. I could go ahead and say, okay, I want to have that table from that data flow and that table from that data flow. The thing is, as soon as I'm going to do that, they need to be in that enhanced compute engine. They need to be hosted, embedded in in premium capacity. And that's something really important to keep in mind as well. How does this thing for gateways and security work? Well, it actually works exactly the same way. The principle of gateway is exactly the same thing. You use the same gateway experience. Either you do it from the Power BI gateway experience in PowerBI.com, or you do it from the Power Platform Admin Center, whatever floats your boat or whatever floats your admin's boat, and it managed the same way. The thing is, what you need to keep in mind is if you want to publish a data flow, you need to be listed as a user that can publish against that data source. That's the same thing as with data sets. You need to be listed as a user that can publish against that. Okay, it's a good thing. Let's say that I want to use an Azure SQL database. Do I need to have a gateway? No, it's the same thing. If you're running cloud-based data sources from the Microsoft ecosystem, you don't necessarily need a gateway. If you want to connect to some other vendor systems, then yes, potentially you are going to need that gateway, or maybe a VNet or something to get the connectivity to those different data sources. How do we secure data flow? The answer is you actually don't. And that's something that bothers me a lot. That is, at this point, a very big drawback. A data flow resides in a workspace, which means that if you have access to the workspace, you have access to the workflow, to the data flows. If you don't want someone using those tables that are inside of your data flow, hide them. That's the only thing. You need to hide them. Security by obfuscation, I know, but they will not be able to use that inside of. They will not be able to use that inside of a Power BI dataset. It's not security, because especially you maybe want to give people access to that table and that table, but not those two tables. Maybe you even want to do row-level security on your data flows. There are already lots of ideas that have been logged on powerbi.ds.com, but they are currently not in the planned status. Most of the time, when you're working with data flows, you will be working with import mode. The story for data query mode is exactly the same. It means that the security is going to be the responsibility of those designing the data set, because the data that is going to be imported in your data flow is going to be imported with the credentials that have been used then. Potentially a service account, potentially an ETL developer's account, potentially an admin account, and that's going to be a lot of data. So if it's sensitive data, you actually need to think about the data security part yourself. Okay, so why are we actually, well, why should we actually be using these things, these Power BI data flows? Well, my personal experience, if we're looking at data flows, if we're looking at this self-service question, the thing is that we want to empower our users. We want to make sure that if they have questions that they want to solve with data, that they can actually do it. Data flows is a tool to do this. The thing is that if we're blocking them from doing these different things, and if they rely on IT development, on IT resources, they'll potentially just be, well, they'll just be fed up because they don't actually want to, well, they don't want to wait for it. They'll probably go try to find a loophole. They're probably going to try to find a way around with Excel and manual processes, maybe even an Access database. They're going to be using all different things that potentially you as an organization might not actually want to. Or they might even start to depend on other third-party data preparation tools, an Alteryx, a Tableau Prep, for instance, a Talent or whatever. They might actually go find their luck elsewhere. So these data flows are for Power Query users or Excel users. It allows them to build data entities that can be reused. It allows them, if they're working with that premium version, to easily compose and orchestrate their different entities across the board. It actually allows them even to build out a staging environment, to build out a production environment by using different workflows and having them depend on each other. It would actually, in theory, also allow them to build out their own proper data warehouse. It allows them to do whatever they actually want to, how creative they are. But it's mostly a part in, it's filling self-service. It's meant for empowering your business users to do things themselves, to start digging, to start investigating themselves. But what is a really crucial thing, and that's the entire paradigm of self-service, is as soon as you have something that works, that needs to be reused, that needs to be able to be shared with other people, that it's talking about the grow up story. How do we make sure that that valid insight gets matured and that it's being part in an enterprise process? Or how do you see it work inside of your organization? And it's something really important to keep in mind as well. How can we potentially even go ahead? How can potentially we even go ahead to extend those data flows? Well, luckily, there are some really cool things that we're doing with, because everything that I've mentioned up till now is just the built-in flavor. It just means that it is Microsoft, it is Power BI managing everything for me. It's going to manage that data lake storage and is going to manage how the data is being stored, which is really cool. I don't need to think about anything. But let's say potentially I want to reuse that data somewhere else outside of Power BI as well. Let's say I want to pick it up with Synapse for something else. Let's say I want to pick it up with Azure Data Factory. Let's say I want to just get the raw CSV files. Luckily, there is this thing called bring your own storage account, which essentially means that if you have an Azure Data Lake storage account of your own or of the organization, you can link that to Power BI. and then it's going to store the data in that external storage account, which means that if you have a tool that can access that storage account, it can access those CSV files as well, and potentially start using all that data that is located in there. Yes, there are some limitations about where it needs to be and how firewalls need to be set. So it's not a click next scenario in most enterprises, but it is really interesting because it actually allows you to get that data for external tools as well. And the process is really simple. If you are a workspace admin, you go to your settings pane for your workspace. If you have those permissions, you can connect to Azure, define, say, okay, I want to use this workspace, this subscription, this resource group, this storage account, and then you can connect it all there as well. There is also this thing called external CDN folder, which means that, okay, bring your own storage account is Power BI reading data into the data lake and then having some other tool pick up that data. External CDN folders is the other way around. We have different tools landing that data inside of our data lake storage account, and then Power BI can actually start using that as well with those external CDN folders. The thing is, the thing that I've mentioned about the data language, that's something that's still a bit tricky right now as well. That manifest needs to be correct. For instance, Azure Data Factory at this point cannot write the exact same manifest that needs to be working. So it's not a silver bullet solution for everything, but potentially it can actually be used. You go ahead and say, okay, I want to use, it helps if I work on the correct screen as well. Go ahead and say, okay, I want to attach a common data model folder, say, okay, where is the path that you need to connect to? And then it's just going to connect to those things as well. Then it's going to connect to, the CDN folder that you need to have. The thing is, I've mentioned a lot of the things. I also want to give you some of the considerations that you have at this point as well, because there is something that you do need to keep in mind. As I mentioned, the cool stuff is so enterprise enhanced compute engine, or those shiny, nifty AI features that I've not discussed right now. They are only premium, and that is a big drawback. That is something that I'll be very open about. Right now, if you're working with a larger data flow, the validation of your queries can take a very, very long time. I've had queries go up to 30 minutes to just validate, where I need to have that screen, that Power BI screen, set to that exact screen, or it's all going to fail. There is improvements. The validation has been, it's been a lot quicker lately as well. And there is also this thing called background validation coming as well, which means that I can just go ahead, click away from the screen, and have all of it run inside of the background. What you need to know as well is if you're modifying the schema, it will drop all the data. It will need to rewrite all the data in there as well. Very important to keep in mind, because if you change the schema on large data flows, you will need to reload all those data flows as well, which can be bothersome at some point. At this point, a data flow can only be modified by an owner of the data flow, which means that the collaboration story working in a team is hard, period. Unless you're working with a shared account or something, the collaboration story with data flows for editing the same data flow is hard. There is improvement coming, but it is, yeah, we'll see it when it gets here. There's some other technical things that might prove a bit difficult. For instance, if you're trying to do your technical implementation for CI/CD, if you're trying to export a data flow and trying to import it somewhere else, it's going to generate a new ID, and then the ID cannot be referenced again. So it is a bit trickier to actually work with it completely. It allows you to do some thinking to get it working in every single piece. Luckily, I haven't checked, but it should be very close. That Power BI data flows should also be becoming a part of our Power BI deployment pipelines. If it hasn't happened already, I do expect it to be arriving very soon, because it was listed in the release wave as well. So there are some drawbacks. The thing is that there are some things that I want to reiterate again before I actually want to reiterate on where I think Power BI data flows can actually shine. I have no issues stating that this is a slide that I've borrowed from SQL Allfather from Matthew Roach. It is essentially, well, as I mentioned, it is self-service data preparation, Powered Query Online. So if you worked in Power BI Desktop, there is a large chance that you'll actually know this experience and that you'll love it as well. It is built on Data Lake Storage Gen 2. It utilizes something called Common Data Model, and it is meant for business users, self-service, to fill their own story, to find their own insights, and to make sure that they can actually do this. It is not a replacement for datasets, because you still need a Power BI dataset to start working with the data that is located in there. In my personal opinion, it's also not a replacement for a data warehouse. If you have that big enterprise corporate data warehouse story, you're probably going to want to lean to tools like Azure Data Factory, maybe even SSIS, to Synapse, to whatever other tool that you want to be using. It is, as I mentioned, self-service. So that's where the shift in user personas can potentially come back to be proving a bit interesting. It is also not a premium only feature. Power BI Data Flows exists for Power BI Pro as well. You just need to think a bit better about what you're doing, which also means that it doesn't cost a dime extra, because it comes together with the storage, with the subscription that you have. If you have Pro, if you have Premium per user, if you have Premium, whatever you have, you're going to be able to work with it. The thing is, it will not work with Power BI Free. Is it the license form, Power BI Free? Why does it? Why is it? Because it doesn't work in a My Workspace. You need to use it in a proper workspace. It can still be a classic workspace, a V1 workspace, but there are some differences. But it requires a workspace, which means that essentially it will not work with a Power BI Free account. It needs to be a Pro subscription if you want to actually do something with it, at least. And pet peeve of Matthew, it is Power BI Data Flows with a small letter D, so it's not a capitalized letter. So for takeaways, I see data flows shine for those business-driven initiatives. If you're end users, if you're business users, if you are a business user and you have questions you want to answer, this is your potential to start doing some things. This is your potential to actually start driving those insights yourself, to start getting data from multiple places, getting those insights and having it easily being reused for different people. Or potentially, let's say you have an existing data warehouse, but maybe there is something, a new dimension, maybe there is something, a new fact that hasn't been built yet. It's on the backlog of the team is understaffed, etc. Maybe you can just quickly build something yourself to actually start building those preliminary insights on. Maybe you want to prototype something to check with your colleagues if it actually can work. So for those fast and easy things to start doing, to start getting those insights. My point of view is that if you have something that works, if you had something that's worth reusing, try to think about that grow up story. Try to make sure that you can mature it into something that works across the organization, that doesn't depend on Joe from accounting to keep his laptop up and running. So make sure that you have a solution that can work across the enterprise that isn't tailored to that single person working there. Personally, I try to always go for the own Azure Data Lake storage as well, so that I have the option later, so that I have the freedom, the flexibility to start doing so. Why am I saying this? You can always change, you can always choose at a later point. The thing is, you will have to reload all the data flows. So you have to make sure that if you're changing the storage mode underneath from the internal managed one to the external or the other way around, you will have to reload all those data flows, which can potentially be bothersome. So one of the use cases that I typically position Power BI data flows for is something that I like to call a MDS Lite, so Master Data Services Lite. Let's say that I have some salespeople and they have a mapping table for something, for a mapping table for a potentially, potentially they have a new regional division. Regions are going to change. They have something that needs to be mapped currently. That is a really interesting thing to say, okay, well, okay, let's build it off this Excel table for now, but rather than having to go implement it into the ETL pipelines, etc., I have them upload the Excel files themselves, have them do the data flow work themselves, have it the way that they feel that works for them. And then if it's located in external data lake storage, then go ahead and grab that data and use that in the different flows that I have. Another really interesting use case that I really like to position it for is for those cloud-based sources like Snow, ServiceNow reporting, for Jira, for instance, for Topdesk, for instance, Zendesk, whatever you want to have, ticketing systems. Not every ticketing system and not every company has those flashy, shiny, expensive SQL connectors. A lot of people are working by connecting to those APIs. Those APIs have limits. You're not allowed to request 100,000 things every 5 minutes, for instance. And if you're working with multiple data sets, those multiple data sets, they're potentially also going to get those same requests, and you're going to be throttled and their data is not going to land, etc. So by putting a data flow in front of this, it's only that data flow that's going to get the data from the cloud-based system, and then you can have all the different data sets connect to that single data flow to actually start using that data as well, to just make sure that we're not hitting the throttling limits as fast. There has been a pretty large announcement in April under coming soon. Soon is not August 2021. I can tell, because there are things that still need to be arriving. And those are things, those are things that I personally think are going to be a really, really big change to what we're working with for Power BI data flows. The thing that I briefly mentioned as well, called background validation, where if your query is if you're saving your query, if you're saving your data flow, you can just go ahead and do something else in Power BI. You don't need to be on that screen. Multiple people contributing on the same data flow. That's going to be a really big thing as well, because it actually also means that you can collaborate on that data flow. Data flows coming to deployment pipelines, etc. So it is a really interesting thing as well that these things are changing. Data flows has changed drastically since its inception in 2018. And I'm convinced that there are going to be some really, really big changes in the coming years as well. Especially the one that we've lately seen with direct query being added. There are some things brewing as well on that direct query experience being expanded upon. So data flows is proving to be a really interesting choice to go for that self-service aspect in your data integration story. The last thing that I want to mention before I go into Q&A is that I've mentioned self-service a lot. The thing is that I am also convinced that self-service isn't done by products and technologies. It's not done, self-service not being done by Power BI, by Qlik, by Tableau, or whatever. It's being done, self-service is being enabled by people and processes and methodologies. It's the way that we talk to each other. It's the way that we communicate with each other. It's the way that we facilitate talking and working with data in organization that makes self-service BI a success. The tool is how we get there. It's a means on our journey. It's not the journey itself. That said, there are a bunch of resources in here. I will post the link to the slides in the announcement as well before I go into Q&A right now. Let's see. So slowly changing dimensions. We've had this as well. What is the difference between shared data sets and a data flow? A data set can be based on many different things. It can be based on a data source, different data sources. It can be based on Excel files, etc. And it's the thing that actually holds the data inside of the model. And it's that model that all our visualizations or tables can actually start using. Data flows is just a container for the data stored in a raw format. It's the data set that's going to do the optimization in the Power BI engine to optimize that data for working with it, for making sure that we can have that blazingly fast requests. I hope that's clear as well. I mentioned the enterprise data warehouse will always have a place. What is the future platform for enterprise data warehouses, tabular models? Azure Analysis Services, SSAS, Power BI. Power BI is great, but it doesn't feel like it replaces classic SSAS for enterprise. If I have to say future, Power BI, period. SSAS, so the SQL Server Analysis Services, it is at a very slow, it's at a much slower release pace. It's limping behind on features. Not everything is going to be supported inside of Power BI. Azure Analysis Services is a different story, where Microsoft themselves have clearly stated that Power BI datasets is going to be, or is actually already, the superset of analysis services, which means that we have more features available for us to start working with it inside of Power BI datasets. Right now, the only reasons that currently still exists is, let's say that you want to have those very dedicated resource, maybe models over 4 terabyte large. You want to have that full flexibility. You want to be able to start and stop the data set, the analysis services engine as you please. And that potentially can be reasons to choose for Azure Analysis Services. The enterprise story, so the governance story, the admin story, is drastically improving as well. I agree that there are still very big kinks, that there are still things that need to be improved upon, but we are seeing some very, very big steps in that being improved. So if you ask me, what is the future platform in the Microsoft ecosystem for tabular models, I say Power BI datasets, period. That's what I say. Are data flows available across all Power BI tiers, free, pro, premium? Briefly discussed this as well. They are not available in free because you need to work in, it needs to be hosted in a shared workspace. Pro and Premium, yes, you can both use them there. Premium has the enhanced compute engine, which allows to do linked entities, compute entities. It allows you to use those AI features for cognitive services, for sentiment analysis, etc. And also the recent streaming data flows that went into preview, let's say 2 months ago. That's the main changes that you have there. So the reusability story across different data flows, across different workspaces, that's something you really need to have premium or premium per user for. Question by Fernando: why Power Platform data flows cannot connect to Power Platform Dataverse tables? Honestly, Fernando, I don't know. I've asked myself the exact same question. So I cannot give an honest answer to this. Then a question: I haven't switched on data flows at my workplace yet because I don't want people to flood Power BI datasets with poor data quality from end users. What is the best approach to governing Power BI data flows to prevent this from happening? Difficult question. The thing is that it boils down to training, it boils down to having that conversation, having that communication, having that organizational story. Maybe you allow only certain people to create data flows. Maybe you only allow people to have certain permissions to create objects after they've done a certain form of training or after they've proven that they know how to think about it. It's a really difficult question to answer, because it is also something that is really dependent on the type of organization you're working with. Meaning that if you have that very rigid enterprise BI type way of working, then it's going to be potentially harder to educate, to mature those users. If you already have a culture where people are doing everything themselves, then it's a matter of making sure that they have a set of best practices to fall back on. Things that I try first is making sure that we have something community of practice, that we have some knowledge sharing within the organization, that we can actually help them, stimulate them to do it better, to show them how much better their results can be if they're actually doing it the right way. Not a conclusive question, but yeah, it's the best I can do with the variables that I have. Question from Alex: Power BI data flows versus Azure Synapse data flows. From what I think is that you're talking about Azure Synapse data flows, so it's the Power Query based inside of Azure Data Factory, inside of Azure Synapse. It's running on mostly the same engine. The difference is that you're probably not going to be landing inside of the same data lake storage. Probably also some changes in the manifest file, but I don't have a conclusive answer because I've not played around with those types of data flows myself. So question from Christian. Are there any backwards compatibility problems? Meaning, should we start building Power Query queries and data flows and then try to copying them in a Power BI desktop file? Potentially, yes. Meaning that Power BI Data Flows is an online service, so it gets updated whenever we don't notice it. It can be 3-4 times a week. Whereas if you have Power BI Desktop, that means that you have a monthly release and then potentially people that are running behind a few months, for instance. So yes, backwards compatibility can be an issue. But you'd have to be doing some special things inside of Power Query to actually start running into backwards compatibility. If you're keeping your Power BI Desktop as up to date as you possibly can, then I don't expect any big issues there, because you usually also try to see that they're not releasing breaking engine changes to the service. That said, let's say 99% sure. There's always potentially going to be something that pops up, but for the most of the general cases that we can see, it should be fairly okay to do it inside of Power Query Online, Power BI Data Flows, and then reusing that query inside of Power BI Desktop. Are there any third parties who have developed data flows for SAP to create the dimensions out of master data? I honestly don't know. I really don't know. No, I really don't know. I think the next question was asked either by the same person or someone else, because it also is about SAP. Is there a community, or is there a community? So yes, it's the same person. Or is there a community which shares data flows that can extract facts and dimensions out of an ERP system? Same thing. I really don't know. I luckily try to steer clear of SAP as far as I can possibly do, with reasons. Will Power BI eventually move to be a browser-based application? Hard question. I don't have access to the product team's roadmap. What I know from things that they've shared publicly at sessions they've delivered themselves is that the different experiences that we're seeing right now from Power Query Online, so Power Platform Data Flows, the ones that we see in Azure Data Factory, the ones that we see in Synapse, the ones that we see in Power BI, should be converging. So they should become the same thing over time. The same thing is what we're seeing as well, is the fact that they've also organized their teams the exact same way. So it's no longer a Power BI team with Power Query. It is a Power Query team which has the engine for all the different products in there. So the fact that they've organized their team in that way means that the story will be converging over time. When? I don't know. I don't have that insight as well. So yes, I think, Leon, that is all the questions that I have.
That's correct. And Benny, thank you very much for such an insightful, I'm going to call it a knowledge sharing webinar, because how you pack so much into the time allowed is really, really, really fantastic. So I really appreciate you being here with us and sharing.
No problem. I had a great time. As I mentioned, it's been more than 2 months, so it is good for me to actually start presenting again to the community, because it's things that I like doing as well. Hopefully in person someday again soon. Hopefully.
Oh, fantastic. We'd love to have you in the UK. Hopefully we can do it in person. But if we can't, then we'd love to have you back again with us virtually.
Sure thing. Sure thing.
Fantastic. Well, once again, thank you very much. And thank you to everybody from the community that joined us for today's Microsoft Power BI UK User Group webinar. I've been your host, Leon Gordon. And once again, thank you to Benny for joining us and delivering such an insightful webinar. And you could have been anywhere in the world, but you've been here with us. So thanks again. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.